Michael is a guy from Florida, and he wants to ask about morality. Well, that's pretty generic. What do you want to ask about morality, Michael? You're on AXP with MD Aware and Johnny P. Angel. Well, not hearing anything. Oh, there you are.
Sorry, hello?
Yeah.
So yeah, sorry, yeah. Not just about morality in general, but more so about the argument for morality for the existence of a God that I've heard many theists usually posit. Like, I know that's one of the favorite arguments that, say, William Lane Craig likes to use. But the way that I've normally heard, I'm not sure if I'm misrepresenting the argument, but I believe the syllogism is something like, if God doesn't exist, then objective morality and moral duties don't exist. Moral objectives, objective morality does exist, therefore God exists. But I always found that first premise was a little bit weird, if not arbitrary, because even if one were to concede the idea of objective morality, I mean, like, I don't know why that necessarily has to be tethered to the idea of a God. Like, I think C.S. Lewis said that, a conscience proves God because that points to a lawgiver, seeing as those are moral law on our heart. But I always figured, and I'm not sure, and what I'm asking is what you guys might think of this interpretation, which is that I always thought that morality could just also be thought to be sort of like a social, if not psychological, form of the idea of like health. Like, we have an idea of what health is objectively. We know what it is when a person's sick or not well. And I always thought that, therefore, if you apply that in a social or psychological context, you could say that something that somebody is doing is bad or evil or wrong.
Sure.
And of course, that would invoke like a myriad, a plethora of nuances when you're like discussing different circumstances or different cultures, I guess. But nonetheless, I'm like, would it be? Do you think it would be fair to call that some sort of sense of objective morality, to look at morality as a sort of social / psychological incarnation of health? I'm not sure. That's what I was wondering about. What you guys thought about that?
MD, what you got? You're a doctor.
I mean, totally. I 100% think that. I mean, the terminology might be problematic. I don't know if you'd call it morality, but certainly our sense of fairness and justice and right and wrong is to a certain extent coded genetically and evolved, and we've done experiments that can demonstrate that sort of thing. The classic one is you have two monkeys in cages beside each other, and you give one of them like one piece of food, and you give the other one two pieces of food, and the one who got one piece of food gets really upset because they recognize that what just happened is unfair. And there's a lot of background, like, even more basic experiments demonstrating that these impressions are not isolated to humans, and they can go down to so-called lower level animals and creatures. But certainly, at some level, it all breaks down to what is biologically good and bad for an organism or for a gene, if you subscribe to the gene theory of evolution, the selfish gene theory, rather. So 100%, like, that's certainly my view, is that all judgments, the objective thing is not the should, right? The objective thing is, when I hit someone, they sustain tissue injury to their body. That's a physical brute fact of biology and physics, and they feel pain. That's the interpretation. Their body interprets that damage as pain, and they're programmed genetically to think pain is negative. It is associated with a negative feeling. And so obviously society has evolved based on those individual level experiences and realities to develop a societal law or societal expectation that we should generally avoid things that give people negative experiences and try to pursue things that give them positive experiences. And I completely believe that it boils down at its base level down to biology. So I 100% agree with you. I don't think that there's any real debate among scientists about that. I think that moral philosophers, have different opinions, perhaps, but maybe they're also not asking the question in exactly the same way. What do you think about that, Michael?
Yeah, no, well, like you said, you agree with me, and I think that what you're saying is just expounding on what I was hinting at, because like the way I've usually seen theists in debates usually talk about this is that, oh, without God, then there is no sense of right or wrong. It's just a sense of preference. But I'm like, I always, even because I'm more or less in a phase of deconstructing my faith. Even when I was more devout, I always thought of the idea of good or bad as that which tends towards life or that which tends towards death, respectively. And in that sense, I always figured morality to be like just the sense of what is promoting health or destroying health in a variety of ways, not just physically, but also psychologically, emotionally. So like when they say that, oh, is sexual assault or rape wrong, and someone will say yes, and then it's like, oh, how can you know that if God doesn't tell you to do it, tell you that it's wrong? I'm like, well, because we can see the harm that it does upon the victim.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I don't think it takes a theologian to be able to decipher that, when somebody's in pain, because when we have the ability to have empathy, that's at least one way that we can ascertain that somebody's in pain. And I don't know, I wasn't sure. I never really heard somebody retort. Maybe that I just haven't watched the right videos, but I've hardly ever heard somebody retort to just when they bring up the argument for morality. And this,
I think the thing that people will retort is they will say, okay, you're stating facts, like, yes, people feel bad when I punch them, but that doesn't mean that I ought not punch them, right? It's the is-ought gap that I think a lot of theists will point to, which is perhaps a fair criticism. This is-ought gap is a thing in moral philosophy. But I think that the solutions that religious and theological explanations comport or put forward, they don't actually solve any problems, or they create problems of their own, right? Just for example, like the question of from where does the moral law truly arise? Is it because God is powerful? And it's a might makes right situation. So we do what God says is good because he's the strongest guy around, or is it right independent of God's strength? In which case, it doesn't actually originate from God. Like there's all of these other problems that smarter and more dedicated people have pointed out about these arguments. But suffice to say that I think the criticism of the view that you and I are agreeing on is that it doesn't actually tell you any oughts. It probably explains from a scientific and a reason perspective why we feel, intuitively, why we are evolved and why our society has evolved to tell us we ought not do those things that harm other people, that detract from health, or whatever reasoning or whatever wordage you chose. That's probably why it is that way, but it doesn't actually tell us that we ought not do those things properly in a moral philosophy type way.
I was just going to ask, one of the clauses like ought not or ought to be predicated of, like, it isn't. I always thought that needs, like, what you should do or what you ought to do, is always based on a desire. If you want to live, you ought to breathe. You ought to feed yourself. You ought to take care of your health. And therefore, in the same way, morally speaking, if you want to live, a healthy life, you ought to do certain moral duties. I don't know.
Right. If you put those premises in, then sure, we can agree on that. but theists will not necessarily agree on that. And moral philosophy, I think, doesn't necessarily assume those outcomes, those ifs. If you want to blank, then you ought to do this. I think, again, without being a philosopher, that moral philosophy is concerned about what ought we do, stop. And then we can go, well, if our goal is X, then we ought to do Y. It's a lot easier. So I think that the arbitrary decision is deciding that we care about well-being, for instance, or we care about minimizing suffering. That is subjective. Once you take that subjective axiom or that subjective goal, then the steps to get there are objective. And that's going back to like Lane Craig's thing, like, oh, it seems like we have objective moral rules. Only if we already agree on what the desired outcome is, then we can make objective assessments against that goal. But I think that people would take issue with where and how you're establishing what the goal is, because I imagine a theist would not agree with that. They would say that there is an ultimate ought, and the ultimate ought is whatever God says ought to happen.
Sure.
So that's what I would imagine some theists might say about that.
And I think to go back to where we started, I think there is a biological and social reality that it harkens back to. Not to belabor the point, but those societies that didn't recognize or honor those biological realities of resource management, individual rights, freedoms, a preference for pleasure over pain, security over wild risk, don't exist anymore, either because they were killed off, outperformed, or individuals left to the extent that they could for societies that would provide those basic biological and social needs. And we haven't really changed our biological organism in the 6,000 years that humans have existed on this earth. And so where we see differences in societies, it's different takes on the same approach. And I tend to notice that in those places where certain groups don't have certain rights or protections, those are places where those individuals have less political power. How convenient that might be the case. So yeah, and as far as how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, of whether or not a moral virtue is objective, subjective, contingent, or whatever that is, that's cool, and that's an interesting question, and hopefully we're not putting the practical, pragmatic approach of looking at it to try to maximize human well-being according to certain metrics that people report they value over the intellectual exercise of figuring out some sort of proof, some sort of philosophical proof for why somebody should prefer X over Y. So that's my take, and we're all on the same page. I appreciate your call.